everyone, Maureen Lamb here. I am talking about teaching outside the canon, and today we're going to talk about Perpetua. Perpetua is just a gem that I found last year, written by Tom Hendrickson and his students, a wonderful commentary that's extremely accessible. And I would say that one of the cool things about Perpetua is that it's very readable Latin, but at the same time, it uses a lot of vocabulary that will come up for my students. This year, they were working towards AP Latin. And so a lot of the vocabulary and the themes would be repeated. And so that was really interesting. But it was a great read with my students. They had a wonderful time reading it. And so, why Perpetua? Perpetua is a Christian saint. Perpetua is from North Africa. And she's also the first female diarist in Latin. So she talks about her journey from her point of view in Latin. Again, extremely readable, interesting Latin about what she's doing and why. She is an educated noblewoman. Not all women at this time were reading and writing in Latin, but obviously Perpetua was. Her full name is Vibia Perpetua. She was the daughter of a nobleman, and she also is a young woman who follows her conscience. She makes her own decisions and she has her own voice. So, writing as she is, as a diarist, she is using her own opinions and she is saying what she believes. And it's not necessarily what the people around her believe. It's not necessarily what the Romans believe. It's not necessarily what the people in North Africa believe, but it is what she believes. And that is what is interesting. She is from Carthage in North Africa, and she is a Roman citizen. Now, for my students, that sometimes was something they didn't know previously. They didn't know that there could be Roman citizens throughout the empire. And so we talked about that. We talked about the fact that there were Roman citizens in North Africa. There were Roman citizens in Britain. There were Roman citizens in Gaul and Spain and Turkey and all over the Roman Empire, in Egypt. And so the idea that someone could be a Roman citizen and live in North Africa was completely something that was normal and something that happened all the time in the ancient world because people gained their citizenship through different ways. Oftentimes it was serving in the army for Romans. In a lot of these provinces too, Rome would settle soldiers. And so sometimes Roman soldiers would settle there. Sometimes people would fight in the auxiliaries and then gain their citizenship. So there are a lot of different ways to gain citizenship. So Perpetua is married and she has a child. She's only 22 years old. Her husband really isn't mentioned, so it's not clear what's going on with him, if he's in the picture at all at this time. In ancient Rome, divorce was very common, but it's really not clear, and maybe because of her Christian beliefs, she doesn't have her husband around. And this is a very stirring picture of her father begging her to reconsider. Another thing that's really interesting is she talks about how she's in pain and suffering because when she goes to jail, she does not have her child. And she wants her little infant with her because first of all, she misses her infant, but also she's a breastfeeding mother. And so she's feeling the pain of having her child away from her and not being able to feed her child. And so I think that's something that's really powerful and a very unique perspective here. And a story that wasn't really told a lot of the time in the ancient world. And so having her write about what she's going through in Latin is really powerful. She's also writing from prison. I think that's something that is really interesting. The conditions must be terrible. Now, whether she wrote it down herself or whether she dictated this to someone, it's really unclear. But at the same time, the fact that these are her words and she's saying them are really interesting. There are some doubters out there who do not think Perpetua wrote her own story, but I think that taking it at face value of what people have said it's to be is the words of Perpetua, I think and talking about her plight and her point of view as a young woman going through all of this, I think that it is by Perpetua. And even if it isn't, it's telling her story. She has a lot of dreams, and my students, when we read this together, really enjoyed reading the dreams, even though some of them were deep and some of them had some kind of disturbing images. So this particular one was she was dreaming about her little brother who had passed away of some sort of cancer or skin infection. And he was being tortured like Tantalus. There was a fountain that he could never drink from, and he was feeling bad and wherever he was in the afterlife. And so she started praying for him. And after that, she has another dream where he can drink water and he's splashing and he's happy. And so showing the depth of care she has for her sibling, and also seeing him at suffering and then at peace, was really comforting for her. And so we talked as a class about that, and how we dream about things that exist and don't exist, maybe people who are there or not there, and what dreams might mean. And it spurred some very interesting conversations. One of my students' favorite parts was the ladder with the many weapons on it. And so Perpetua was climbing this ladder. We listened to Stairway to Heaven on the way in, just so, then there was a dragon at the bottom, and Perpetua had to climb this ladder, and it was just something that was hard to overcome. And thinking about the different weapons and thinking about the dragon, and eventually she was able to overcome it, but it was a really wonderful image. And I think this type of imagery is similar to the type of imagery that we see in the Aeneid, and so that's why it makes it a very good comparison here. She also dreams that she is a gladiator defeating her foe, and she's fighting an Egyptian who's a very bad Egyptian, and her this Egyptian fighter who she's fighting against, and she has to make herself into a man to fight this Egyptian in her dream. And we talked about what this means, and the stereotypes that this is combating in many ways is that women can't be strong, or women can't fight, and what society must have thought, her society, of women and why she has to think of herself as a man when she's fighting as a gladiator. So again, an interesting conversation. And Perpetua is not killed for being a Christian. She is killed for not sacrificing to the emperor, who would be a godlike figure, or even worshipped as a god in this case, the cult of the emperor. And so she refuses to sacrifice to the emperor and instead says she is a Christian, and she cannot be anything other than what she is, which is a Christian. And the magistrate says, "Pity your son, pity your father with his gray hairs." Her father is beaten after she says, "I am a Christian," in front of her eyes. And then later on, when she's being taken to be killed, she sees her child. She sees her father tearing out his beard in anguish, and she pities his old age. But for her, she knows that this is the right choice. She doesn't want to go against her conscience. And this is interesting because she does not give in to the pressure. And having these conversations with my students brings up a lot of really tough topics and a lot of things that are challenging to discuss and think about. But there are some things that are very real, where students have to choose between what they're told to do and what their conscience is telling them to do, and talk about what the implications are there. And so even though she's going through all of this in 400 something AD, there are still a lot of elements to her story that students can relate to. And that's something that's really interesting as well. This is a very compelling story for students to read. Again, like I mentioned, Tom Hendrickson and his students did this wonderful commentary of the Passion of Perpetua that's extremely accessible, has great background information, and is offered free online, or you can buy a print copy as well. So this is a really wonderful resource. And if you want to reach out, please feel free to do so. I love chatting about this. I'm happy to share any resources I have from when I taught Perpetua last year. I'm going to be teaching it again this year. Feel free to reach out. I'm on Twitter at Latin Tech Tools, Instagram Latin Tech Tools. You're welcome to visit my site and use any of my resources on there, or just reach out by email, latintechTools@gmail.com. Thank you so much.